All right, our second presenter for the evening is Mr. Lawson Smith. His tutorial is entitled Tolkien, Reinterpreting Immortality Through Myth. Please welcome Mr. Smith.
No one can escape death. It takes all, disregarding age, religion, or ethnicity. Despite attempts spanning diverse cultures, the acquisition of immortality appears to only exist in myth or story, reserved for the godlike heroes who are too great for the world of mortals. These legendary figures are respected in literature as beyond human. They become superhuman. J.R.R. Tolkien explores this superhuman immortality in his Elves of The Lord of the Rings. Lacking nothing, the elves outperform man in every aspect. It would appear in his books that Tolkien designed his elves as examples of the purest and highest human form. However, Tolkien's personal letters and reflections seem to clash with such a premise. They actually challenge the reverence for the elven race established in his works. Given these inconsistencies, what then is Tolkien's purpose? My answer and thesis is as follows. Though he seems to promote the superiority of immortal elves, Tolkien's works and thoughts highlight the curse associated with continued existence and the blessings to be found in a mortal life. Furthermore, the paradox between the glorification of the elven race and the pain associated with their immortality exists because of Tolkien's desire to display truth indirectly in the form of myth, as myth is the only means by which he believes deeper significance can be conveyed to his readers. To defend this argument, I will examine the initial convictions about immortality one obtains by a simple reading of his works, followed by the counter-proposals of Tolkien's true intent laid out in his personal letters and reflections. Proceeding from this exploration and defense regarding mortality and immortality, I will turn to Tolkien's purpose for conveying his ideas in the specific method of myth, examining both the structure and application. Tolkien's works seem to praise immortality, or at least promote a deep respect and awe for the elven race to which this gift is granted. In his most famous work, The Lord of the Rings, many of the characters regard the elves with fear, admiration, and interest. The elves are what they appear to be to both the reader and other races in Tolkien's universe. The highest manifestation of human physical ability, namely beauty, strength, and intelligence. From this view, Tolkien's elves seem to resemble ancient demigods in their embodiment and completion of perfect human nature. Despite this apparent glorification of the immortal nature of elves, it is in this so-called gift of immortality that we find the faults of the elven race. The first fault is a hostile disposition to change. Given their continued existence, the elven race finds comfort in the steadiness of the past, inevitably causing a fear of change and a wearisome mentality. This leads to the second problem that the elves face. They actually develop an explicit desire for death. Thus, though granted abilities man can only dream of, the elven race finds suffering in prolonged life, leading to a disdain for change and ultimately a desire for death. Given these detriments of immortality, mortality should be received as a gift, rather than a punishment. Through mortality, man enjoys the ability of escape and regrowth, two gifts that are greatly coveted by the immortal elves. Unlike the elven race, men can escape and leave the world and are not bound to it in hope or in weariness. Arda, the entire world on which Middle-earth is a continent, is marked by sin and inhabited by sinful races. Therefore, escape from a permanent existence among destruction and pain proves invaluable to the race of man. The second gift, regrowth, is one that cannot be experienced by one individual alone, but rather the entire race as a whole. Verlin Flieger, a Tolkien scholar, surmises, without death there can be no rebirth. Elves preserve, men grow and die and grow again. Unlike the elves who have grown stubborn to change and resent the ever-shifting patterns of the world, mankind, through new generations, begins anew, and in this rebirth, eventually outperforms the elven race and inherits dominion of Middle-earth. Man's gift does not end in death. He is not a neglected creature, sentenced to perish and fade from existence. In death, the race of man is removed from a sinful world to a perfect, harmonious recreation, a freedom not specifically promised to the elves. Iluvatar, Tolkien's godlike character, promises to man an afterlife analogous to the Christian resurrection in heaven. Furthermore, Iluvatar also blesses the activities of man during his mortal life, promising that all that they do redounds at the end only to the glory of my work. Thus, the gift of mortality to man, though seeming to hinder his aspiration of living forever, comes with the promises of divine interaction and hopeful purpose in his shortened life. Given a closer analysis of Tolkien's works and an inspection of Tolkien's personal reflections, his purpose for the race of elves becomes more clear: to demonstrate the embodiment of the human desire for immortality, yet show the hidden pains of an immortal life. However, we are still left with the apparent contradiction between Tolkien's glorification of the elven race and the lesson he intends to impart from a negative view of the elves. This discrepancy comes through Tolkien's style of writing through the form of myth. In myth, the formation of an idea, often a life lesson, is more important than the actual narrative. To be considered a myth, a work of literature must meet many specific guidelines. The most important of these is the inner consistency of reality. Tolkien explains this importance in terms of primary and secondary worlds. The primary world, the world of the author and the intended audience, is filled with hopes and desires from the real physical world. The secondary world, the created world of the story, is entered by the mind of the reader and must be relatable enough to the laws of nature in the primary world to create the willing suspension of disbelief. The author can use the different constructions of the secondary world to highlight completed ideas or fulfill desires that are restricted in the primary world, resulting in deeper significance to the reader. Given Tolkien's deep respect for myth, one should not be surprised that he chooses to form his stories in a similar manner, conveying truth indirectly, and what is most important to him is often not stated but underlies the whole story. Though Tolkien's purpose for using the form of myth is made clear, his intended lesson is slightly more ambiguous. Tolkien was a man of the classics, in love with the past, and highly skeptical of modern technology, referencing it as improved means to deteriorated ends, and therefore his portrayal of elven hesitance to change might reflect his own adverse dispositions. Tolkien informs his audience, as Richard Purtill captures, that as the quantity of life increases, the quality decreases, until every last minute is a weariness. His work served as a reminder of man's finitude and the burdens that extended life would bring. Tolkien's disapproval of earthly immortality, though, does not condemn Christian eternal life. Through the elves, Tolkien expresses our human sin of rejecting the purpose of God and a desire to continue in our own sin and selfishness. The human race often neglects the created purpose, to glorify God, and instead seeks to prolong their own dominion on the earth. The gift of death is the gift of escape from our sin. With this knowledge, we see the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, more specifically from the tree of life that would allow them to live in their sinful state forever, as a gift, a protection from the endless serial longevity that governs the lives of elves. Instead, the gift of mortality given to the first parents can be enjoyed with the promise of a greater immortality in a perfect, unfallen state. Tolkien's works are not simply reflections of fictional myth. Instead, he seeks a higher purpose, namely to enter the realm of myth, where he can draw the reader into a secondary world of fantasy, in which the reader can experience the unfolding of primary desires. In specific regards to immortality, Tolkien uses the secondary world of Middle-earth to expound on the primary desire of eternal life. In using the race of elves, Tolkien demonstrates the end to which this desire leads, a life of wearisome continued existence. The immortality of the elves is not to be envied. However, Tolkien does not present this conclusion directly. Instead, he draws the reader into a myth, where the truth is laid out indirectly and then formed fully by the mind of the reader. Jesus taught his disciples in a similar manner, presenting a parable upon which reflection would lead to understanding. Full understanding comes best internally, stimulated by the subconscious and formed by one's own reasoning. Tolkien masters his art and his manner of myth. From its harmonious creation to its tear-filled farewell, the stories of the world of Arda guide the passions and decisions of the reader. In dealing with the common ageless desire for immortality, Tolkien does not present a cure for mortality, as many of the ancient stories sought to do. Instead, through the power of myth, he indirectly guides the desires of the reader away from a false immortality. He uncovers the pure desire, a desire for eternal existence in a separate world devoid of evil and destruction, glorifying one's creator. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a great paper. As a Tolkien fan, I learned some things about his writing that I didn't previously know, so it's always nice. In the introduction, you use this line, Tolkien's desire to display the truth indirectly in the form of myth, and then you say, the only means by which Tolkien believes deeper significance can be conveyed to his readers. Later in the paper, you expound upon that a little bit. I understand that Tolkien thought that myth was the only way that these deeper truths could be conveyed. I'm curious if you agree with him that myth is the only way that some of these deeper truths can be effectively communicated.
I think in Tolkien's purpose, yes. The way he wrote and the way he tried to write, he originally started out writing poems and figured out that he just couldn't do it the right way. And so he stuck with myth, and that was his way of writing, his sub-creation, his manner of glorifying God through his writing. In terms of a general big picture, no, I think there are other ways. God has blessed everybody with different gifts. And so I think for other people, other authors, other writers, there are other ways of conveying deeper truth.
Okay, that's helpful. Do you think that when Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings, he was aware of a broader narrative context to the story, that even though he denounced that there was an allegory taking place, he knew that certain things could be lifted and interpreted out of context, and if they were not properly interpreted within the broader context of the narrative story of The Lord of the Rings, that people might not get the meaning of what he was trying to do in the right way?
I think that is a fear for any writer. I think yes. I'm sure he thought, yes, somebody could easily, or not easily, somebody could take my writings and misinterpret them. I think though any writer that could happen too, especially Jesus' parables, like his parable of the great pearl. We're not actually called to go sell all our possessions for one pearl or one farm. So I think though there is that danger, his overall good and the overall truth that can be found in his works greatly outshines that danger.
Great. So taking all this, and now I want to look at another book for just a moment. You might be familiar with it, the Bible. It's a giant narrative, right? There's a story that's being told across the pages of Scripture of creation and fall and redemption and reconciliation, and one day the consummation of all things. I'm curious what you think the danger might be for theologians or people who do biblical studies of looking at verses in the Bible that talk about death or immortality and take them out of the context of the narrative story of redemption that's being told in Scripture. Just as much as it might be dangerous for somebody reading Tolkien to misinterpret what's going on in the elves or the doom of man, surely that's just as dangerous for us when we're handling the Scriptures, right? So what kind of correctives might we learn from Tolkien and the way that Tolkien would have us interpret his stories that we could then carry over into the interpretation of the Scriptures?
I think I'm understanding your question correctly. So when reading Tolkien, you see this primary desire, a desire that the human race over the generations has had of immortality. And so you see that desire fully formed in the nature of elves, in the way the elves interact, in the way the elves live. And so you see that desire, but you also see the consequences. You see their selfishness, their desire for death, their hesitance to change. And so I think as Christians, we can see that and see that, yes, we have this inner desire for immortality because we were originally created to be immortal. But in our sinful state, we need to neglect that desire and accept God's gift to us of death in hopes for this greater immortality that comes after death. So I think in reading Tolkien, a Christian can assume a correct view of both death and the afterlife.
Thank you.
That was a really good paper. Thank you. I enjoyed reading it. You mentioned that Tolkien himself was really aware of the classical tradition. And so, as I'm sure you know, in the classical tradition, there's this desire for immortality through the retelling of these various deeds of the heroes. And I'm wondering if you think in any way Tolkien himself was kind of after that kind of immortality through his writings. Like, how do you think he, by the creating of those myths, is he actually maybe seeking a certain kind of narrative immortality, either for himself or for his characters?
If you look at the life of Tolkien, he originally did not want to publish his works. He was a very humble man, kind of scared of his own ideas. And so it was really through his great friends that got him to publish his works. So I don't think there was a prideful element to that. Also, though, Tolkien sought out to write some of these myths for Britain that Britain lacked. And so I think in some ways, yes, he sought to kind of have his legacy in terms of his writings to continue. After World War I, many of his close friends who were writers died, and so that was one of his challenges, was to write these stories that they never got to do, and he saw his way, his way of glorifying God was through writing. And so I think in some ways, yes, he did want these stories to continue kind of as Britain's mythology, but I don't think there was a personal pride associated with that.
That's a good answer. I was thinking about, I assume you've seen the movies also. And I was just, this is a little outside the scope of the paper, but do you think the portrayal of the elves with respect to their relationship with immortality, that comes across in the movies or more in the books?
I think you see it a little bit in the movies and a little bit in the original trilogy, the books. The biggest part that you'll find, though, is in the Silmarillion.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I do think Peter Jackson did a good job in the original trilogy. I don't consider the Hobbit movies as part of it because I won't go in there. But I do think, yes, Peter Jackson did a good job and portrays that a little bit.
Yeah. So I remember just when reading the Silmarillion, I was really struck by the sadness in the elves and the way that I really wasn't in other portrayals or other parts of the story. So I thought you brought that out very nicely. And I guess my other question would be, did the elves really have any choice other than to respond to their situation in that way? I mean, would there be the possibility of them overcoming their resistance to change? I mean, are they just really in a situation where any kind of redemption for them is impossible?
It appears to be that way. The elves fell in the West. If you've read the Silmarillion, I'm sure you know the story. And so their nature then was corrupted. The world's corrupted. Their nature is tied to the world, and so therefore it's just there's just a sin in the whole cycle. The elves, when they die, if either their body just is tired of the age or they're killed in war, they go to the West, the halls of Mandos, and from there they can be reborn, reincarnated. They have like a body and a spirit. Their spirit is reincarnated. And for a while, it doesn't remember its old life, but eventually it will. And so no matter what they do, their cycle is still tied to the world. And as long as there's sin in the world, they suffer.
Thanks. It was very enjoyable read. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lawson. It was very good. My questions are, at least my first couple of questions are sort of literary in nature. And so In your paper, you were talking about myth and allegory and Tolkien's attitudes toward such. I come to your paper and my question from my own background and my own work, where people use these kind of terms quite freely, and I'm not sure all know exactly how they're using them. So I guess the first question I have, since you didn't really define these in your paper, would be just a real quick definition of how Tolkien would distinguish myth from allegory.
Yes, so Tolkien didn't set out to write his characters as specific allegories in the way that Lewis did, for example.
Yeah.
For instance, certain characters like Frodo or Aragorn or Gandalf represent Christ at times, but they're not the sole representatives of Christ, nor do they exclusively represent Christ. So there's other people that also will represent Christ, and at times they don't. So I think when you kind of look at these different characters, they're not allegorical because they don't. Like Aslan is supposed to represent Christ in his character, but also in what he does. And Tolkien's characters are kind of just, he has those illusions so that our primary minds we're more comfortable with them in the secondary world. And so that's kind of where I'm going with allegory. In terms of myth is basically just a story that's more than entertainment. It promotes ideas or lessons, and it doesn't necessarily have to be false. So you have like the Christian myth of the Bible. Did that answer your question?
Okay. Why is it that he was so opposed to allegory? What about allegory, and what about his approach and his endeavor was so uncomfortable?
So he really liked the idea of the reader forming the reader's own interpretation. This is why he goes into this whole secondary world of Middle Earth. It's like a thought project that we enter in and then we get our own ideas out of. He's not spoon-feeding us. And so I think he was afraid with, I think I said on page 13 maybe. He was afraid that, there's a quote somewhere, he's afraid that if he was too specific, they might lose this general picture, and if he was too specific in how he presented different characters, people wouldn't use their minds to grasp it. It's kind of like contemporary art where you look at something and it's totally different for different people, but the artist has kind of set a framework around it from which you can get some sort of idea from.
I understand. So, a couple more, question or two that's more thematic in nature. So, toward the end of your paper, you state that the immortality of the elves is not to be envied. And I want to know what you think about that statement and just how you, to what extent you see this as in tension with Christian views. And I'll let you deal with that first.
Okay. So watching the movies or reading the books, you see the elves as they're kind of like the superheroes. Legolas is like the coolest guy. And so you kind of begin to view the elves as something bigger than they actually are. And so you associate everything with the elves as also this great being, including their immortality. And so you subconsciously start thinking immortality is awesome. And it's again something that civilizations throughout history have thought. And so, but Tolkien goes and in his elves he shows that immortality is not to be envied because it leads to this desire for death and this fear of change. And so, in terms of Christian immortality, I think the elven immortality and Christian immortality are two different things because one's in a perfect state, namely a new earth. The other is in this current earth, or is in a world similar to this current earth where there is sin. And so I think as Christians, we need to be ready to leave this world and not try to be in this world forever because of its sin, but also this does not apply to Christian immortality because in a perfect world, immortality is a gift.
That's fine. All right, you answered my other questions, so.
I just have one other question, and you can just help me understand what's going on in Peter Jackson's portrayal of the love relationship between Aragon and Arwen. When Lord Elrod is like really reluctant for her to go and allow herself to no longer be immortal, I don't understand it, because I think everything that you're saying about immortality not being a desirous thing here is right. So I'm trying to understand why he wouldn't have wanted Arwen to be mortal. It seems like there is an escape that would be present for her, and given his love for her, why would he not want that for Arwen to go and marry and live with Aragon?
So you have the Aragorn and Arwen, and then also in the Silmarillion you have Beren and Luthien. And these are two great loves between the elves and the men. Both the girls are elves and the men and the males are men. And so in the Silmarillion between Beren and Luthien, Luthien gives up her immortality to be with Beren. And so actually their descendants are then Elros and Elrond. Elros and Elrond are given the choice to be elves or to be man, or to be immortal. Elros, Elrond's brother, chooses to be immortal, and Elrond chooses to be immortal. So you have that. Elrond's already made a choice for his family and his descendants to be immortal. Elros's brother is actually the great ancestor of Aragorn, and so that line has chosen to be mortal. And so you're kind of seeing some of that again. When it comes down to Aragorn and Arwen, for one, Elrond is not sure if Aragorn's going to survive. He is fighting for Middle-earth against this great evil, and so there's that fear of that. Whereas if Arwen gave up Aragorn, she could go live in the West and in a less sinful world. There's still some sin, but it's less sinful, and so that would be a happier life. And at the end, at the Return of the King and some of the appendixes, you see the death of Aragorn and then Arwen's suffering after that. And she lives for about a year in just complete suffering, because though she is mortal at that point, she still has this immortal nature in her from her elven birth. And so there's this pain inside of her that Elrond foresaw, that when Aragorn would die, her nature and her then chosen nature would conflict and cause her great pain and suffering. And so that's what he was afraid of.
All right, we have a couple of minutes left if anyone has a question in the audience. Yes, Andrew.
I would say two things to that. One, Tom Bombadil is not known to be a sinner. The elves have a specific point in which they have fallen and they have sinned. Tom Bombadil seems to be a creation above that, almost like one of the angels that rules or that cultivates the world of Arda. And so I think for that reason, he's not quite the same. Also, Tolkien's purpose was to a big picture. Of course, he's going to have different characters that come and go and present anomalies, because that's the way the real world is. not everything's the exact same. And in this way, to get the secondary world to line up with the primary world, he's going to have a similar setup. So I don't think that goes against his overall picture. I think that's just one of the ways that he makes the secondary world similar to the primary world.
All right, let's thank Mr. Smith once again.